It's a great pleasure to be able to open up this conference with what I hope will try and set the scene from a quite a macro perspective on some of the challenges and opportunities we face as we move towards a low-carbon society. And that's something that I'm working on with colleagues at Warwick University and particularly in the business school. And it's a challenge in which business will play a central part. I'll talk, of course, about some of the policy issues around climate change. But policymakers can do all that they can do a lot of things. If business does not respond, if there's not the technology and the changes that take place in the business community that drive us towards lower levels of carbon emissions, then we're not going to get there. I want to talk under four headings. First, to just give you some broad perspective on the challenge of the low-carbon society. How big is the challenge? What does it look like in terms of some of the past trends that we've seen in terms of the way our economy and society has developed? Second, I want to then look at that from two different perspectives. One, a more structural perspective from the point of view of the structure of the economy. What does this mean for the way the structure of the economy might change and the way key sectors might be affected? And I'll focus particularly on the challenges for energy and transport. As Jonathan said, I used to work in the transport sector. The aviation industry is quite in the spotlight in this whole debate, and that's one of the things that's encouraged me to continue to work in this area. And I'll then go on also to talk about policy instruments and measures. How are the incentives and the policies that are going to be necessary to drive us in this direction, how are they going to be developed? And then finally, very briefly, I'll talk about key steps and business opportunities. I'll just give some initial thoughts on that because we've got other speakers later in today, this morning and this afternoon, who are really going to pick up on that from their own individual perspective. Now, I think this is quite an illuminating chart. It focuses on CO2 emissions, so it doesn't include all the greenhouse gas emissions that are contributing to climate change. But it looks at it in terms of the amount generated per head of population in all these different countries. And on that, on the chart, I've put in the horizontal dotted lines, a 2050 target as identified by the UK Committee on Climate Change. I've marked it down slightly to reflect the fact this is CO2 and doesn't include all the greenhouse gases. Now, by 2050, if we're going to move to what the scientists suggest is a sustainable climate, every person who's living on the planet around about that time, and that's an estimated 9 billion people, will need to be each generating about 2 to 2.5 tons of CO2 through their economic activities. And you can see that for some economies, such as Brazil and India, that is higher than where they are now. So they've got some headroom potentially to increase their footprint. But most economies around the world, and the big hitters, are going to have to very significantly reduce their footprint. In the UK, we're around about 10 tonnes of CO2 per capita. So we've got to, as the Committee on Climate Change has said, make a roughly 80% cut. US, they're up at 20 tonnes of CO2 per person. And Australia and Canada are also relatively high. It seems countries with a large land mass generate higher emissions per head, partly because of the travel footprint of travelling around a large land mass. So you might say, well, 2050 is a long way off. That's 40 years. We're moving into the next decade within a month. But we've got plenty of time. Well, we haven't got plenty of time because if you look at the scenarios, which again I'm taking this from the Climate Change Committee, if you look at the scenarios that have been constructed and how we might get there, globally, we've got to get to some peak in CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions sometime within the next decade. Obviously, if we don't do that, it's going to be even harder to get the very big reductions that we need. So there are two challenges built in here. One is getting to a peak, getting to a stabilisation where CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions are not increasing, and then building on from that, moving to a situation where they're reducing. And most of the scenarios that have been constructed suggest that peak would need to come roughly within the next decade. And that decade, as I said, starts in less than a month. That's the decade of the 2010s. The Climate Change Committee in the UK have done their scenarios on the basis of a 2016 peak. But certainly within the next decade, that is the sort of challenge that we've got to make. And if you look at how we've been doing against that challenge, if anything, the trends have been moving slightly in the wrong direction. This slide shows two things. One is that associated with world economic growth, we've seen generally emissions growth which has been slightly below the rate of world growth, but has still been a growth trend, not the sort of declines that we need to see. And whereas when we went into the 80s and 90s, the growth of emissions seemed to be slowing down relative to world growth, recently it's been picking up, and that's partly because of the composition of world growth. The very energy-hungry developing and emerging markets that were growing in the mid-2000s, including China, have been more emissions-rich in terms of their economic growth, and that has pushed up the growth rate. Now, we first of all need to get to some sort of plateau, so we want to have that red bar increasing. I don't think anyone's suggesting that the world economy is not going to grow. We need to have the red bar increasing with, as we look over the next decade, the lighter shaded bar flattening off. And then we need to have red bars increasing with negative shaded bars, the lighter shaded bars. Now, just to give you an indication of how profound that challenge is, through the whole history of our industrial society, emissions growth and economic growth have gone broadly hand in hand. Not exactly at the same rate, but they've both gone up together. The only times we've seen declines in emissions have been at times of recession, world war, and big economic traumas such as the collapse of the Soviet Union. So we're really going to have to achieve something that we haven't achieved in our industrial history before. And that's going to mean that we're going to have to harness a major international effort and a large number of instruments of policy and a large part of our society and business sector in this direction. We will not achieve it by little changes at the fringe. It's going to have to mean some quite significant differences. Now, where are those differences going to have to take place? One of the things that struck me when I was in the aviation industry, I felt then, I was working for British Airways, so maybe I was naturally going to feel this, that the aviation industry was unfairly spotlighted because it was one of just a number of contributors to the problem of climate change. And the reality is you can't single out one particular type of activity, one aspect of our economy and say, yes, it's all their fault. If you stop them, or if they change, that's going to solve the problem. Firstly, because the challenge is so big, as I've highlighted, but secondly, if we look at the sources of greenhouse gas emissions, they come from a very wide range of activities. About a quarter from the power generation sector, electricity generation, about 14% from general industry, 13% from transport, 8% from buildings, particularly domestic buildings. And those are the main elements that come from energy use. And then there are some other aspects that come from non-energy activities. Changes in land use, you might think of that as deforestation and related activities. And agriculture itself is actually a very major source of emissions, not necessarily CO2, but other greenhouse gases, including methane.